Hey everybody, wanted to talk about the end of World War One. If you see on the PowerPoint here, you see a cemetery, a memorial to soldiers killed in World War One, like this one in Belgium, are located throughout Europe. Soldiers and civilians around the world celebrated the end of World War One in November of 1918. But when they wondered what armistice meant, one soldier said, "Well, it's time to bury the dead." So a lot of people had died and it had been a terrible war. The number of soldiers killed in World War One was beyond anything the world had ever experienced. 5 million soldiers Allied and 3.5 million soldiers from the Central Powers died in combat. Uh, so, if we look at this next slide, an entire generation of young men in many European nations, including France, 90% of the healthy young men that had served in World War One. If you hear right now, you hear one of our babies talking. We'll just listen a second. Okay, well, I think that's the nightly howling. Maybe it's over now. Oh, they keep going. That's the babies. All right, 7 out of 10 young men from Europe who served were killed or wounded. The United States didn't have that same extreme level of devastation because we came in late, and we were kind of like the backup to push the German forces back. Um, Even though we did lose 116,000 troops and about 200,000 were wounded. If we look on this chart right here, we have deaths in World War One, and you have the country, and then you have the battle deaths in millions: 500,000, 1 million, 1.5 million, and 2 million. Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Great Britain, France, and the United States. And you can see Germany lost 1.75 million, Russia 1.75 million, Austria, Hungary 1.25 million, Great Britain almost a million, France 1.25 million. The United States, we're down here. We're not at the 500,000 mark. We're at the 116,000 mark right there. Financial losses, along with shocking human losses, many parts of Europe's factories and farms and cities were left in ruin. If you see these pictures here, it says for mile after mile, there was nothing left. One British visitor said about the French countryside, no building was livable and no field was fit for the plow. So, of course, there were severe food shortages. The overall economic cost of the war was gigantic. $30 billion worth of property had been destroyed. The Allies spent $145 billion on the war effort, and the Central Powers spent $63 billion on the war effort. France and Britain had borrowed large amounts of money to fight the war and now were deeply in debt to American banks. And Germany was also in debt and its people were facing starvation. And to top this all off, we have something that may be a little familiar right now. We had the 1918 influenza pandemic. Um, Extremely contagious and deadly over 2 years. It killed approximately 30 million people. So, way more than the war itself. And here is a poster. This is how to save yourself from influenza. Whenever you cough or sneeze, make sure hold your hand or get a handkerchief over your mouth. I can barely read it here because it's old. Uh, and don't put in your mouth fingers, pencils, or anything that does not belong there. That still makes sense to these days. You shouldn't put your fingers or a pencil in your mouth. Um, the epidemic started in Kansas at an Army training camp. Spread through the air, and American soldiers quickly spread the disease to other Army camps. One American doctor said, as he saw the bodies pile up in Massachusetts, that this beats any sight he had ever seen in the battlefields of France. Half of the Americans who died during this time period died from the flu. Um, it changed life everywhere in the United States, much like the COVID pandemic is going to change our lives in the next year or two. In Chicago, the flu doubled the normal death rate, and many people who were killed were young and strong. Um, Kearney, Nebraska imposed a quarantine. You're familiar with that word because we've been in a semi state of quarantine, forbidding people who were ill from leaving their homes. Um, we banned public gatherings, we closed school down, and a man here named Dan Tonkel remembered what life was like for children in his hometown of Goldsboro, North Carolina. He says, I felt like I was walking on eggshells. I was afraid to go out to play with my playmates, my classmates, my neighbors. I remember I was actually afraid to breathe. People were afraid to talk to each other. It was like, don't breathe in my face. Don't even look at me because you might give me the germs that will kill me. And although there was no cure for the flu, uh, people would do odd things like surround their kids with raw onions or hang bags of garlic around their necks. They said they smelled awful, but it was okay because everyone smelled bad. And by the time the pandemic ended in 1919, 800,000 Americans at home and abroad had been killed. Um, as it says here today, vaccinations help prevent major outbreaks of the flu and other contagious diseases. Hopefully, we'll have a vaccine soon for what's going on now. Um, Here I'm going to show a short video about the flu, and then that'll be it for today. And you guys have a good night.
At first, it can seem like a common cold. Stuffy nose, cough, sore throat. But when you begin to feel tired, achy, and feverish, you know you've probably got something worse. The flu. Running from late fall into spring, flu season in the U.S. can afflict as much as 20% of the population. In a typical year, more than 200,000 Americans are hospitalized for flu-related complications. Thanks to vaccines and antiviral drugs, the death rate from the flu is only around 0.1%. But as many as 30 to 40,000 Americans still die annually from the flu, most of them people over 65. Worldwide, that number can reach as high as 250,000 to 500,000. And every so often, the flu morphs from a seasonal nuisance into something far more dangerous, an epidemic, or even a pandemic. That's what happened in 1918, when influenza spread across the United States, Europe, and Asia, infecting 500 million people worldwide and killing some 30 to 50 million. In terms of deadly force, The 1918 flu is rivaled in history only by the infamous Black Death, or bubonic plague, which terrorized the world in the 14th century and caused some 25 million deaths in Europe, about 1/3 of the continent's population at the time. From its relatively mild origins in an army camp in Fort Riley, Kansas in March 1918, the flu traveled to Europe with American soldiers headed to World War I. By May, it had reportedly caused some 8 million deaths in Spain alone, earning it the name Spanish flu. No effective flu vaccine or treatment existed at the time. In fact, most doctors mistakenly believed flu was caused by a bacteria and not a virus. Scientists, including Jonas Salk, had developed a working flu vaccine by the 1940s, when it was first used on soldiers during World War II. Though there have been 4 influenza pandemics since 1918, none have taken the lethal toll of the Spanish flu. Today, as people around the globe become ever more interconnected, experts warn that the world is overdue for a worldwide influenza pandemic. The CDC says the best way to prevent the flu is to get the flu shot every year. Yet only slightly more than 40% of Americans line up for their flu shot each year. The flu vaccine isn't perfect, but it can reduce your risk of becoming sick by 50 to 60%. So this flu season, learn from history and protect yourself against this seasonal health hazard.